Welcome to the ICP TTA Integrating Victim Services into EOC Operations during mass violence and domestic terrorism incidents. This course is for victim service professionals. We're very happy to have you here today. My name is Terry Bose, and I am one of the two operators of the program, and joined here today with a university EMC, Carol Walton. This course is brought to you as a part of a new program helping communities prepare for integration of victim services into emergency planning. We operate under a grant from the Department of Justice's Office for Victims of Crime. Carol and I today will cover 5 important topics with you, and will be available for answering questions after you have viewed this session. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce to you a past chair of the prestigious Emergency Management Assistance Compact Executive Committee, Carol Walton.
Thank you, Terry. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to be a part of this training event, and I really hope that everyone who has an opportunity to view the training slides in the future will take away new information that can be beneficial to you guys. Let's get started by looking at the objectives for the day. By the end of this course, participants should have an understanding of how to use the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, organization chart to create staffing for a Joint Family Support Operations Center, a Family Assistance Center, and a Family Reception Center. This Family Reception Center was previously known as the Family Reunification Center, so it might be a little bit of a new term for some of you. To simulate the activation of these 3 centers using your jurisdictional processes and protocols, these can include timeframes and backup personnel contingencies, and to utilize jurisdictional communication protocols to request resources and relay information between that Joint Family Support Operations Center and the Emergency Operations Center, or EOC. Because this training is specific to the integration of victim services into EOC operations during times of mass violence and domestic terrorism incidents, it's really important that we define both mass violence and domestic terrorism before we really move any further into the training. I don't typically like to read off the slides, but to make sure that we are as accurate as possible, this slide will seem like I'm reading off the slide to you. Mass violence refers to an intentional violent criminal act for which a formal investigation has been opened by either the FBI or another law enforcement agency that results in physical, emotional, or psychological injury to a significantly large number of people, as to significantly increase the burden of victim assistance and compensation for the responding jurisdiction. And under the 2001 USA Patriot Act, domestic terrorism is defined as activities that A, involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any single state, B, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and C, occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. Now that we've defined mass violence and domestic terrorism, let's begin with our first section. The purpose of this section of the training is going to be to familiarize everyone with the National Incident Management System, or NIMS. NIMS is a flexible framework that was developed, and it's applicable to all types of hazards and can be used by all size jurisdictions, whether you're a large or a small jurisdiction, because NIMS provides stakeholders with a shared vocabulary, systems, and processes that help to successfully deliver capabilities as needed. There are 3 major components of the NIMS framework. The first one is resource management. This describes standard mechanisms that help us manage resources both before and during incidents in order to allow organizations to more effectively share resources when needed. And these resources can include personnel, equipment, teams, facilities, or supplies. The second component is the command and coordination component. It describes leadership roles, processes, and recommended organizational structures for incident management at the operational and at the incident support levels. And it explains how these structures interact with each other to help manage incidents effectively and efficiently. The Incident Command System, or ICS, falls under this command and coordination component, and we're going to speak about that in just a moment. And the third component is the communications and information management component, and it describes systems and methods that help to ensure that incident personnel and other decision makers have the means and the information that they need to make and to communicate decisions in a timely manner. The Incident Command System, or ICS, it's a standardized approach to command and control or incident management at an incident scene. And as we mentioned on the previous slide, this falls under that command and coordination component of NIMS, and it can be used by all types of organizations, all levels of governments, non-government organizations, and even the private sector can use ICS to help manage any kind or size of an incident. ICS is based on some NIMS management characteristics, which help contribute to that overall strength and efficiency of the system. And because of this, ICS provides some specific advantages. And some of these advantages include chain of command. And this details how authority will flow through the hierarchy of an incident management organization. It includes span of control, and this really refers to the number of individuals or resources that a single supervisor can manage during an incident and manage effectively. Concise roles and responsibilities of ICS positions, and these can include the incident commander, general staff, command staff positions. It also encourages the use of common terms rather than radio codes, acronyms, and discipline-specific jargon. And the last one I'm going to mention is it encourages the development and use of a common communications plan and interoperable communications processes and systems. And these can include both voice and data options, and they help maintain connectivity, they achieve situational awareness, and they communicate information sharing, which, by the way, helps with that third component of NIMS that we mentioned on the previous slide, the communications and information management component. Next, Terry's going to talk with us about some of the terminology that I referred to when I was mentioning the advantages of using ICS.
Thank you so much, Carol. I will briefly introduce this next section, which covers terminology. It's one of the 5 tenets of incident command that Carol just talked about, and that is common terminology. For you as victim service professionals, it will be essential for you to speak the same language as the responders that you'll be working with. Don't worry, it's not an entirely foreign language. There's a lot of jargon and a lot of acronyms that you will want to familiarize yourself with. So we're not going to read through all of the terminology today. You will be provided with a glossary of the most relative NIMS and EOC terminologies. And then we'll also provide you with a link to the comprehensive FEMA glossary. And then after you familiarize yourself with these terms, you should feel very comfortable communicating within this system. At this point, then Carol will take over, and she's going to talk about the role of EOCs.
Thank you, Terry. During this next section, we're going to talk about the role of an EOC or Emergency Operations Center and what they can do to support incidents of mass violence and domestic terrorism. Mass violence and domestic terrorism incidents usually will be very large in scope. They'll involve multiple agencies from all levels of government and can include all disciplines of emergency response, such as law enforcement, fire, search and rescue, EMS, and even some other services that may not typically be involved in emergency response. These incidents can also elicit a massive media response. Because of these factors, oftentimes local resources will become overwhelmed almost immediately and need some support. This is why we want to talk about the role of the EOC. The EOC can support those ground operations. Some of the EOC's main tasks include multi-agency coordination. This can assist with decision-making and policy changes as necessary. They help facilitate both the upstream and downstream communication flow between local, regional, state, tribal, and federal agencies. They can help share information with the public, and they can locate and allocate resources. Terry also has some additional information about EOCs and how they support victim services that he's going to share with us.
So the operations of emergency operations centers cannot really be described singularly. They come in all shapes and sizes, and these shapes and sizes are determined primarily by the available community resources. However, to help all different types of jurisdictions that run all different types of emergency operations centers, FEMA has designed a system that is scalable to the size and complexity of different incidents and different communities with differing resources. This means that the protocols that they've introduced into running these incidents can be used on any shape or size system. The system connects communities with fewer resources to local, state, regional, tribal, and federal resources. The system also provides support for agencies operating within it. When incorporated into the local planning process, this will help victim services by giving them the access, the immediate access to facilities, activation, and logistical support that they have historically had to provide on their own. EOCs are there to support response activities. Victim services are indeed response activities. They are organized into the operations section along with police, fire, and EMS. An EOC is not there to tell you how to do your job, and they're not going to do that. They will systematically provide personnel, equipment, facilities, feeding services, transportation, and other immediate needs to run an FRC, an FAC, or a CRC. These that you see on the screen here are just some of the types of support that you can expect from the EOC when you're setting up your family reception center, your family assistance center, or your community resiliency center. Another benefit for victim service providers are the activation protocols provided. You'll no longer have to self-activate after public notification of incidents. You shouldn't have to introduce yourself to incident command and talk your way in to doing the job that you need to do. So this program will help build those relationships and formalize those procedures for getting you onto the scene and into the facilities where you're going to deliver your services. The FRC personnel will be activated by protocols that you help plan. You can respond immediately, sometimes to predetermined facilities, and get to work much sooner. Activation procedures vary from community to community, but typically today include various methods simultaneously: text messages, phone calls, pagers, and these are typically delivered by third-party or commercial mass notification systems. Some of you may have heard of some of these, like Everbridge and First Response and many other types. The EOC supports response by coordinating disciplines and organizations involved, as Carol explained previously. Coordination is accomplished by communications. This means that the EOC is an information hub. Information flows in and out of the EOC consistently and constantly, following a chain of command that Carol will tell you about later. At this time, Carol will now talk to you about the guidance that NIMS provides for resource coordination.
Thank you, Terry. As you can see from this diagram, information flows from the local jurisdiction, the incident scene, up through the state EOC, up to the federal agencies, often housed at a joint field office. And the key to this is that the state EOC kind of acts as that go-between between the federal and the local, but also that the local EOC kind of acts as that go-between between the incident commander and the on-scene team and that state EOC. Let's take just another moment to talk just a little bit more about that flow of information and the resource request, just because we want to help reinforce the importance of that flow. One of the specific advantages of ICS that we mentioned early on in today's training was that chain of command that kind of detailed how the authority would flow through incident management. Well, that same system is used to share information and request resources. And this is really vital to a successful response. So by following this system that we kind of looked at that diagram previously, we allow for accountability of resources. We avoid duplicate requests for limited resources, because often those resources might be needed in another location. Even that might be part of the incident that you're working. We help ensure we're providing a single, accurate message to the public, and we can document and maintain cost records. Those may not seem important up front, but when we get closer to the end, we'll really realize that documentation is necessary to request any type of reimbursement that we might be seeking. And when we bypass any link in that chain of command, there can be some serious consequences. Some of the resources that we really need might not arrive in a timely manner. Some information that leadership needs to make decisions may not flow through the chain and may not reach them to help them with those decisions. And again, that reimbursement for expenses may be hampered later on in the response and recovery efforts because proper records and documentation were not maintained. Earlier, we mentioned that an EOC assists in multi-agency coordination activities, and that these activities help the on-scene command structure. And so right now you may be sitting here asking yourself why I'm really that concerned about coordination activities that help on-scene command structure. But as Terry mentioned earlier, while victim services may not be on scene, they fall within that operations section of the on-scene command, and they're delivering response services to victims, their families, their friends, and other impacted persons. So in that way, the victim services really is considered a branch of the on-scene command system and can benefit from some of these coordination efforts. So let's talk about three of these specifically. I'd like to speak to you for just a moment about mutual aid request, about long-term recovery planning, and financial needs coordinations. Jurisdictions will have mutual aid agreements in place. And these agreements will detail how resources can be shared across jurisdictional boundaries. This can include how the agreements should be activated and the process that we would use to request resources. When requesting resources, it can become confusing. So to help avoid that confusion, FEMA has developed a list that kind of defines the capabilities, sizes, number, training of personnel, if that's applicable to the resource. For some resources, obviously they have not typed every resource that we have, but this list of resources that I've been talking about is referred to a list of typed resources. And again, resources in this list can include personnel, equipment, supplies, teams. One of the main things we wanted to bring up right now, because it might be of special interest to anyone watching this training, is that one of the teams that has been typed by FEMA is a behavioral health professional team. So that might be of specific interest to you. We also want to mention that while mutual aid requests for victim services may go through the state Victims of Crime Act or VOCA administrator and the Federal Office of Victims of Crime, these requests will still need to be made through the EOC channels that your jurisdiction uses, just to make sure that that's properly recorded and that the EOC and community leadership know that the requests have been made. The next thing I wanted to mention is that the EOC can also coordinate with pre-identified agencies who can assist with long-term recovery or resiliency planning actions. This can be extremely useful because local resources will already be heavily engaged in that immediate response efforts, especially at a family assistance center. So to keep them from having to try to do long-term planning while they're responding, this could be a very beneficial coordination element. And finally, I want to mention that the EOC can also help coordinate funding efforts. And this is especially true for those immediate needs at the Joint Family Support Operations Center and the Family Assistance Center. Next, I think we are going to take a short tour of an EOC. Is that right, Terry?
That is correct. Thank you for that. That's a tremendous amount of important information for our viewers. So next up, we're going to see an Emergency Operations Center in action. The city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania has provided for public viewing a tour of their operations center during the recent COVID activations at their location. This is a good example of a medium-sized local jurisdictions EOC. And a lot of the things that you're going to hear are very relevant when it comes to mass violence and domestic terrorism incidents, similar types of stresses on local resources and responders. So you're also going to be guided on this tour by the EOC director. So each EOC, when it's activated, will have someone that is the director. In most local jurisdictions, this is going to be the emergency manager or the emergency management coordinator. And then in larger jurisdictions, large metropolitan areas and states, the EOC director is a full-time position. A lot of these EOCs operate 24 hours, 365 days a week, and just at varying levels, and then ramp up their activation levels during emergencies. So this will be a good chance for everyone to see how an EOC runs.
Today, the City of Lancaster launched its Emergency Operations Center, or the EOC. The mayor asked me to give a brief presentation of what the EOC is, what it does, and how it operates. So we'll walk into the Emergency Operations Center now. The Emergency Operations Center is a national standard in which we operate under emergencies. When we operate in an emergency, the communication level goes from us to the county, to the state, to the federal government. This is a standardized process, standardized emergency response system. So any Emergency Operations Center should be operating exactly like this. It's broken into 5 parts: operations, planning and intelligence, finance administration, and logistics section, as well as the leadership component of that. That's the 5 sections. Logistics section is specifically in charge of and operates the logistics of the event. So the facilities that are necessary, the tools that are necessary, as well as personnel. So a lot of that comes out of the logistics section, and understanding how we respond, with what resources, and where do we acquire those resources. In addition, finance is going to serve a very important role in this emergency, in that there's a number of different federal agencies as well as state funding sources that are available to not only the city itself, but also to our local businesses impacted by this. So they're working diligently right now to identify what those funding sources are, what we need to do to apply for them to make sure that our community is made whole, but more importantly, that our small businesses are taken care of. They also account for any expenditures we have in the EOC. Planning and intelligence is really our forward-thinking end of our operation. Their function is saying, okay, we know we got what we're doing today, and we have the specific goals and objectives we got to do today. They're looking at what happens next week, what happens in the 3rd week, what happens in the 4th week of this event. What are the kind of facilities and tools that we're going to need for the future? They're going to do that in a number of different ways. We have a lot of history from China, from Europe, also in other cities as well, is trying to understand the spread of this virus and what happens when it spreads and what are the obligations going to be for the city. The operations section is just that. It handles our boots on the ground, communication with the sheriff's department, communication with the fire department, communication with the hospital, communication with our staff, our boots on the ground, of identifying what it is they need to get done in this operation, how to do that, communicating that effect, and making that happen. The administration side, first and foremost, is the leader of the EOC. The city manager is the EOC director. We have an EOC manager who's in charge of the operation, but most importantly in this section is communications. And communications is going to be key in this emergency, in that we have to communicate correctly, effectively, and efficiently so that people know what they should be doing, what they can be doing, and for their own protection and protection of their family members. Communications will be start sending out daily updates from a local perspective, also including some of those national and regional perspectives as well. But it really is going to be your local access to what I should do, what's happening locally, and what the impacts are locally. That'll be coming out on a daily basis to identify what's changed, what you should be doing as a community, and how we operate. With that, it is key from the city of Lancaster's perspective to make sure that we keep our citizens safe, informed, and healthy through this incident. This is an incident that we're not familiar with. We've dealt with floods and earthquakes and things of this nature. This is new for us, but at the same token, the tools that are at our disposal are the same. How do we respond to problems? How do we communicate to the public actions? And that is standard in what we do from an emergency operations perspective. Thank you for your time.
So before we move on, I would like to reiterate a couple points that was made during the video. First, he mentioned that they're standardized operations, and that's something that we had mentioned earlier, that the FEMA has created these protocols that standardize the way that all emergency operations centers operate, and that helps when it comes time to use and implement mutual aid resources that Carol was speaking about earlier. He also mentioned the planning ahead for the next day and the next week and the next month's activities. That's very important with these mass violence, domestic terrorism incidents, so that when you are operating as an FRC, you should already be planning to staff up your FAC. And then similarly, during the 8 to 10 days that you're operating the Family Assistance Center, you should be putting together a plan for your resiliency center and those activities as well. And then finally, something that was very relevant, he talked about the importance of communication and to communicate correctly, effectively, and efficiently. Those are all things that are equally important during mass crime and domestic terrorism events. Next up, we're going to talk about, we've talked about what the EOC can do for victim service professionals. Now let's talk about the victim service roles and responsibilities within the system. Operating as a formal part of the response in the operations section of the EOC will not change how you do your job in any way. The changes will basically come in communications. This includes how you're activated, how you request resources, and how you maintain documentation. We talked earlier about activation, so next let's look at documentation. There are 3 areas where documentation is important during a response. And this is going to be accountability with the incident status and responder activities. Regarding personnel accountability, it's important to follow local protocols when reporting. This typically means signing in so that your chain of command knows that all the functions are filled. It's very important that the chain of command knows who's where doing what jobs. And so whatever the sign-in procedure, whether it be a paper sign-in or a digital sign-in, it's important to know these and follow these when you've been activated. Regarding reporting incident status, victim service providers will sometimes during your interviews with witnesses, survivors, friends and families, be given information that might be important to various parts of the response, be it the on-scene response and information that might be vital to safety there, to information that is eventually important during investigations. So it's important that not only do you document these, but when it's necessary, pass this information through your chain of command so that if it's important safety information for those people that might still be operating on the scene of a crime, that they get that in a timely manner. And then thirdly is the activity that you do. Document what you do, who you've talked to, what things you've talked about, which parts of your job roles you've done on a daily basis. So this is also very important. And as Carol said, this documentation process is extremely vital later when the local governments are working with their state and federal partners and working on being reimbursed for the things that they've done during the response. So you'll need to operate within the local incident command parameters. So each jurisdiction will have a different way that they do things. A very popular method is to use the paper or digital forms that FEMA has created. The 3 sections that we talked about earlier, the personnel accountability, information status, and activity logs, each have their own FEMA form. So just make sure that when you're being onboarded into this system and you're being trained to fill one of the positions within the system, that this is something that you get training on. Remember, for all of this, be very proactive. If training's not offered, ask. Tell the people that are onboarding you into the EOC structure that you would like to know about these communications, the documentation, and these things. Most places do a really good job training the people that they've put into these positions, but it's just always helpful to be very proactive yourself and make sure that you and your organization get all the training that you want and that you need. Then finally, the third part of communications that's going to be different for victim service providers is that of requesting resources. There's a lot of different types of communications that go on within an EOC and around an EOC. Emergency communications at the top of the list, but then right there below it, resource requests. So every jurisdiction, again, is going to have a different way. It might just be that you pick up a phone and call someone in logistics, or you may get up and walk across the room if you've got some logistics people there and make the request. Typically, it's going to be some sort of written or digital request. Many jurisdictions use software packages that are meant for EOC operations. The federal government, FEMA, and all the states use a package called Web EOC. And so if that's the way that your jurisdiction does business, then you'll need to be trained on that as well, and then provided with a position-specific login. So the login that you get will sometimes be your name and a position, or it may be your position. And so you may share that login with anyone else that does your role on a rotating basis. So if there are 2 shifts, you would sign out of that role, and then the person that is relieving you would sign into that. So this is the way that the basic foundation of the EOC is laid out. During the video, you heard the EOC director talk about operations, planning, logistics, and the finance and administration sections, as well as then the leadership, which comes from the command staff, including the PIO and safety personnel as well. These stay the same during the different phases of emergency operations. Again, it's scalable. You may not need a finance administration for a small, short duration event. However, during most of these mass violence and domestic terrorism events, they're more complex, they're larger, and their duration is typically going to be long enough that you will fill all of these positions. The FRC will take place during the response phase. The FAC will be the transition phase from response to recovery, and then you'll be well into recovery when you set up the CRC. So what you're seeing now is simply a sample of what the victim services, or what we would call the joint family support branch, might look like. Again, these are scalable. It could be larger, it could be smaller, and you could have many variations of each of these positions. This is just an example, and you can see that when you change from the FRC to the FAC, you don't change a lot of the positions, just change the way that the system functions, but a lot of the jobs are the same. You're still doing victim identification. You're still working with patient tracking, police missing persons. You still need food services and security and IT. So all those things stay the same. And remember, this is one branch of the operations section, and then the operations section is just one section of those 4. So you can see that you can have a lot of individuals working at any type of an incident. So next up, Carol is going to rejoin here, and she's going to talk about transitioning into recovery.
Thank you, Terry. FEMA defines recovery as those capabilities necessary to assist communities that were infected by an incident to recover or return to normal or return to a new normal in an effective manner. And jurisdictions always want recovery to begin as soon as possible because they want to get things back to normal, or that as near as normal as possible, just as quickly as possible. So let's take just a moment to look at this diagram of the recovery continuum. And notice specifically that it includes short-term, intermediate, and long-term recovery curves in the continuum. Just to help you get a feel for what each of these means, I want to give you just a few examples. Some examples of short-term recovery might include clearing primary transportation routes that have been impacted, providing emergency medical care, or maybe providing shelter. Some examples of that intermediate recovery might include providing an interim housing solution, but that has moved past the sheltering, doing some infrastructure repair and restoration, maybe ensuring that there's some continuity for medical care, even if it has to be through a temporary facility because the medical care facility was damaged or destroyed. And some examples of long-term recovery might include developing some permanent housing solutions, implementing some economic revitalization strategies because businesses may have been impacted, and doing some follow-up for ongoing counseling for victims. I also want you to notice when you look at this continuum that short-term recovery begins very soon after an incident occurs. So I want you to be ready for the on-scene responders and most likely the Emergency Operations Center to begin this transition to recovery, while victim services really are just starting to ramp up and move into that high gear. Each jurisdiction will have some processes in place, though, that help to continue to assist with response efforts. Some of the pieces like the EOC and the on-scene response might be transitioning over to that recovery phase. If a jurisdiction happens to use emergency support functions or ESFs, they may provide resources from a recovery support function, or sometimes the ESFs may continue to support recovery efforts as well as those response efforts. One recommendation I would make is that you can work with your jurisdiction prior to an incident to help you identify the processes they have developed so that if needed, you already know how to continue to request resources and things like that and provide information flow. During our next section of training, Terry is going to talk about what happens after someone has been activated to assist with family services.
Thank you very much, Carol. So this is that time when you're like, oh my gosh, I just got the text, my pager went off, now what? Okay. And we don't want you to feel like that. We want you to say, okay, I got my activation, I got the text, I'm ready to go, I know what to do, and I'm confident and I feel good. That comes from knowing what to expect. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some things to expect when you are activated and deployed to the FRC, FAC, CRC, or the GIFSOC for that matter. So to be comfortable, first thing that I want to talk about is that you want to know that everything is good, not just with the job that you're doing, but also at home while you're there doing your job. I know that some of the researchers at Harvard have shown that a lot of the stress from responders during mass casualty events, including these types of events, has to do with wondering what is going on back home. So we know that these mass violence and domestic terrorism events, they affect not just the individuals there, but they affect entire communities. And that includes the friends and families of the responders and the responders themselves, obviously, but their friends and families as well. So it helps if you know that your family and your household is going to be in good shape while you're gone. So do the things that you need to do based on where you live, your family, your home. It's always going to be different if you own a home or if you're in an apartment. If you have kids and pets, those need to be provided for. So take the steps that you need personally for your own secure frame of mind when you have to respond, because you may be gone for several hours or even 1, 2, 3 days on an initial assignment. You never know. Also be ready to go so that you can activate in a timely manner. A go bag is a very important thing. There's a lot of go bag samples and ideas that can be found at FEMA.gov online. But just remember, if you take medications, make sure that those are in there, some personal items, cell phone chargers, just the basic things that you're going to need to be gone from home for a while. Then when it does happen, report on time. Be aware of all those potential sites that you identified during the planning process. Know how to get to those places, and majority of the time, hopefully, good planning will put you into one of those places, but also know that every single incident is different, and no matter how much good planning you do, you may end up activated at a site that was determined after the incident began, just because of where it happened and what the situation is at that time. Also, ensure access. So whatever credentials you may have been provided, make sure you have those with you. You're not going to be able to get in. And so make sure that if you have a badge or whatever it is that you need to respond and report to the FRC upon the initial incident activation, that you have those with you. So once you show up, okay, now, I'm ready. I did all my pre-planning, and I'm prepared and I feel good. I'm ready to go to work. What's going to happen when I show up to an FRC that's operating under an EOC? So, and this is probably not a big change for most of you. A lot of this stuff, again, was part of the same duties that you did when the FRC and FACs were operating up sort of in their own silo. Sign in as soon as you arrive. It's really important that, again, that people know that you're there and that your position has been filled. Report to your supervisor for immediate orders or instructions. No matter how well you've been trained and practiced and done the drills and done the exercises, there's every chance that your supervisor may have something different for you to do when you show up at an incident. Again, these are fluid situations, and there's a lot of decisions that end up having to be made that are different than the way that things were planned. It's really important, obviously, log into any IT equipment that's assigned to you, test it for operability, make sure that your logins work, that you have access to all the sites, all the software that you need. For example, if you're in a jurisdiction that uses Web EOC, make sure that you can get into that account so that there's no delay in requesting resources that you need through the system. There should be, if you are part of the initial response to the FRC or the GIFSOC, you should, once everyone gets in place, or most people get in place, there should be an official initial briefing. Make sure that you're there, pay attention to that, take notes that are relevant to your position if you need to. If you're showing up as a shift replacement, again, there's going to be operational periods of typically 8 hours or 12-hour shifts. When you show up to replace someone, also make sure that you meet with them face to face. And after each shift will have a general overview that will review the situation status for everyone. But then you're going to want to face with the person that you're replacing and find out what's going on specifically in your position. So what have they done? What's the status? What needs done? There's always going to be challenges. There's always going to be unmet needs. So if you don't get a good report, make sure you're asking questions. What are the challenges? Are there any unmet needs right now? And so you need to get briefed properly by the person you're replacing. The victim services is a unique role in the EOC and ICS structure, there aren't a lot of incidents where victim services occur. Now we've seen several. There's one going on right now in Miami with a very unique situation with a lot of victims. So they will have a victim services and family assistance center going on there for that response. But this is typically a very unique type of incident and a very unique role. So this is not something that most EOC members are used to dealing with. So unique incidents, unique roles, and this is a mission that they don't typically do. So one of the things that's unique about these incidents is that they're quite often, vast majority of the time, the on-scene response is mitigated very quickly. More often than not, the perpetrator will either take their own life or lose their life during a conflict with law enforcement, or be arrested by law enforcement very, very rapidly. It's not often that these incidents go on for hours and hours or days. So what this means to victim services, that the things that victim services does, victim identification, family tracking, patient tracking, missing persons, all of these things, counseling services, these become the focus very early on in the event. So this changes the way that things might operate, because what's going to happen is a lot of the on-scene services will shut down, and it will change from a response to an investigation at the point at the incident scene. And so the support then also changes. This can work in the favor of victim services or against them. If it's not properly planned, you can see support services shutting down because they're in the mindset that they're supporting things that happen on the incident scene. However, if we get involved in the planning and we've got the proper planning in place, this can help victim services, because now we're freeing up support resources that were aimed at the scene and can now help what we have going on at the FRC, and then the FAC, and eventually the Resiliency Center as well. I think that we've covered a lot of space here for you today. There's going to be a question and answer session available to your organizations. To wrap things up, Carol is going to leave you with a brief review. Carol?
Thank you, Terry. I appreciate that. So again, as Terry said, as we're wrapping up, we just want to do just a quick recap of the things that we talked about today. We defined some of the common terms that are used in the National Incident Management System and in the Emergency Operations Center. We discussed utilizing the organizational chart as it applies to the Joint Family Support Operations Center, the Family Reception Center, and the Family Assistance Center. And we discussed implementing the jurisdictional activation processes of your local jurisdiction to stand up all three of these centers. Then we talked about utilizing communications used by the local jurisdiction to relay information to the Emergency Operations Center and to help make requests for assistance or resources that you need. So thank you all. I really appreciate you being a part of this training. And Terry, I'm going to hand this back over to you.
Thank you, Carol. I hope that everyone understands how lucky that our program is to have subject matter experts such as Carol on our staff, and being very dedicated to these purposes. So Carol, is a university emergency management coordinator. And as I mentioned earlier, past chair of EMAC Executive Task Force, and also has served as the operations manager for the state of Arkansas Department of Emergency Management. So she knows her way very well around an emergency operations center. Then I've also taught at National Fire Academy, NFPA Emergency and EMI, and have set up some EOCs for some different clients in different industries as well. So your sponsoring agency can get in contact with myself at this email address and phone number and schedule a time, and Carol and I will get on a Zoom or Microsoft Teams meeting and be very happy to answer any questions that you may have. You can write those questions down and submit them to your organization. You can tune in to the question and answer session and ask those for yourself. We encourage you to do that. I think that back and forth, two-way communication is probably the best way to dig in and answer the questions you might have and discuss the topics that we looked at here today, and really make sure that you get all the knowledge, skill, and abilities that you need from this training to get out there and become a really good active part of this planning process, which is really a foundational goal of the entire program. So again, thank you very much. And thank you for all of the work that you do, and look forward to continuing to work with you as a part of ICP TTA. Have a great day.